Hi and welcome. This is Mohammed Kubaib. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, we'll talk about securing disk access in Azure for Azure VDA or Citrix DaaS. If you find this video useful, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for the future updates. If you want to learn more about Citrix, Azure, or AWS related technologies, you can check out my bestseller Udemy course, which is also available in Udemy for Business. So by default in Azure, when you create any disk, either through virtual machine or manually, if you create any disk, by default, it is exposed to public access. So it means that you can copy the disk URI and you can download this disk from anywhere. So in order to demonstrate, so as you can see here, I have a disk, so which I deployed for my virtual machine. So if I go to this disk and if I go to networking, currently this option is enabled, which is enable public access from all networks. So this is by default. So let's say if I go to disk export and then if I select generate URL, so it will create a URL. So with that URL I can go to the particular link and I can download the disk. So I can download it from anywhere from the internet. So this is the URL it is generating. So for example, if I click copy and if I open another tab in my browser and if I paste it, as you can see here, in couple of seconds, it will start downloading the disk. So as you can see, so it is asking me to store the disk. For example, let's say if I click on save, so you can see it is downloading now. So this is how data breach can happen. So if you are keeping the disk access as public. So in any Azure infrastructure, it is highly recommended not to enable public access, either only enable private access or disable both public and private access. So in certain scenario, disabling both public and private access, which may cause issues. For example, let's say if you are deploying Citrix DaaS on Microsoft Azure, then if you are selecting disable public and private access, then your MCS will not be able to spin up VMs because it requires a disk access. So in that case, what you can do, you can choose the second option, which is disable public access and enable private access. So with this, your disk will only be accessible from the subnet which you mentioned. So it will not be able to access it from the public internet. So even though if somebody is having the disk URL, they will not be able to download your disk. They can only download your disk within your subnet or within your network. So, in order to implement a restriction of public access and enable only private access to the disk, so we need to have a resource group, and then we need to have something called disk access, and then we need to have a private endpoint. So, these three things first we need to create, and then we will create Azure policy. That policy will have the rule to disable public access and enable the private access. So, let's go with the resource group first. So, I'm going to the resource group blade here, and then I'm going to create a resource group. As you can see, the resource group is created. So now we are going to create a disk access. So go to the search box and select disk access. So here let's click on create. So resource group, I'm going to choose the resource group which I created, which is disk restrict RG. And then we need to give a name. So again, I'm going to give a name as VDA hyphen disk hyphen restrict hyphen disk access. So the location will be central US. So private endpoint, I'm not adding at this moment, so we can add this later. So I will click on review and create once again. So the disk access is completed. So let's go to the disk access resource. So this is my disk access resource. So I need to go to the setting, and there is an option called here private endpoint connection. So we need to create a private endpoint connection for this disk access. So let's click on private endpoint. So here resource group, I'm going to select the same resource group which I created in the previous step. So here I need to give the name for the private endpoint. So VDI hyphen disk hyphen stick hyphen PE. So this is my private endpoint name. The location will be, region will be same. So let me click on next. So here target sub resource, it will automatically, it will take this as disk. So the meaning of this is this will enable the private access to my disk which are getting deployed in the resource group. Let me select the virtual network. So I'm going to select the virtual network which is AVD test VNet, and this will be the subnet. So private IP configuration, I'm keeping dynamically allocate IP address. So this is basically for the private endpoint, the IP address. So it will automatically allocate the available IP address from this subnet. So I'm not going to assign anything static here. So the next one is the DNS configuration. So here you need to choose what type of DNS configuration you need for your private endpoint connections. So I'll go with the Azure Private DNS Zone. So if you have your own DNS, you can use that. So for simplicity and best practice, always choose the Private DNS Zone in Azure itself. So I'll go to the next tab, and then I will select review and create. So now the private endpoint connection is also completed. So the next step is we need to create a Azure policy. So to do that, we need to go to the policy blade. So here we need to click on assignments. So under assignment, we can select assign policy. So here the first option is scope. So the meaning of this is where you wanted to apply this policy. By default, the entire subscription is selected. However, in our case, we wanted to apply to particular resource group, which is VDI hyphen disk hyphen restrict RG. So any disk which getting deployed under this resource group will have this policy. Select. Now exclusion, if you wanted to exclude any resources within this resource group, you can add here. Otherwise, you can leave this as it is. So now the policy definition. So there are ready-made templates available in Microsoft to restrict the disk access. So we can search here. So as you can see, we have the template which is configure manage disk to disable public network access. So you no need to go through any custom template creation. So by default, it is available. So this will disable the public access and only enable private access. So assignment name, so you can customize this name. So I'm going to keep the same name as my template. Along with, I will select VDA hyphen RG hyphen restrict hyphen policy, and then click on next. So here select the location. So all my resource available in central US. So you need to select according to your resource location. So this is very important. Resource ID for the disk access. So we have created a disk access in the earlier step, right? So we need to select that particular disk access over here. So this is the disk access I have created. So we need to select this. So once you select this, only from this. So once we have selected this, let's click on next. So here we have an option for the remediation. So remediation is basically what it will do. It will check existing disk whether any public access is enabled. So if it is enabled, it will try to disable and enable private access. So if you don't want that, then do not create the remediation task. So in this case, I will go with the remediation task, although I don't have any resources in that resource group. But as a best practice, you have to enable this when you're doing it in the production. So I'll keep all the remaining options as it is, and then I'll click next. Non-compliance message. For example, if you have any disk in your resource group having public access enabled, then it will display a message with the non-compliance. So I'll just mention as disk access public. So let's click on next. So you can review your configuration here, and then we can click on create. So this will create a policy, and it will apply this policy to the resource group which we have mentioned, and any disk which is getting created under that resource group By default now it will be enabled with the private access only, and public access will be disabled. So our policy is ready now, as you can see. So now let's see how it works. So I will go to the disk and I will try to create a disk here now. So I'm going to select the resource group. So I'll give the name test-disk restrict, and the location, zone, everything I'll keep as it is, and I'll change the size because for this testing I'll just keep 4 GB here. So once you select your size, click next encryption. So I'll keep the default encryption and the networking. So as you can see here, by default it will take enable public access from all network, although we will not change anything here. So we'll still go with the default option, and we will see how our policy is remediating this. So I will click on review and create. So the disk creation is completed. So let's go to the resource. So let's go to the networking. So as you can see, automatically it's set to disable public access and enable private access. So now if you wanted to export the disk and if you wanted to check whether it is working, go to the disk export option and click on generate URL. So the URL is generated now. So I'll copy this URL and I'll go to the browser and I'll try to download the disk, and we'll see what is the behavior. So as you can see, it is saying authorization failure. The request is not authorized to perform this operation. So the meaning of this is now my disk is not available over the public internet. So it is only restricted to the private access. So in order to validate the private access, what I will do, I have a virtual machine here. So I'll log into that virtual machine, and from that virtual machine, I'll try to access this disk, and we'll see whether it is allowing me to access the disk or download the disk. So I have logged into this particular VM. So I'll open the Edge browser. So I'm going to paste the URL here. So as you can see, the disk is now getting downloaded. So this is because our VM is privately accessing that disk. So if I try to access it from the internet, it will not be available because of the policies restricting the public access. So this is how you can secure your disk access and disable the public access on the disk level. So if you are deploying any Azure infrastructure with disk storage, highly recommend you enable these settings. So now coming into the Citrix DaaS deployment and Azure. So when you are deploying Citrix DaaS on Azure, you have to make sure that disk access is restricted for the public and only enabled for the private access. So in order to achieve, so first you need to follow the procedure which I have covered in the earlier step. So once you have these policies and everything is ready, so here in this Citrix DaaS portal, you need to go to the hosting blade. So under that, you need to select your hosting connection. So here you can click on edit connection, and then you need to select this particular option, which is route traffic through Citrix Cloud Connectors. So in order to achieve the disk restriction to the public internet, first you need to configure the steps which I followed in the previous step, and then you need to enable this particular option. So the moment you select this one, all the traffic will go over the cloud connector privately. So let's click on apply. Then you can save the connections. So once you have these settings, then you can go ahead and deploy your machine catalog. It will deploy all the disk or VMs with the private access only, and it will disable the public access. So this is how you can secure your Citrix DaaS on Microsoft Azure when it comes to disk storage security.